The angel called us God's hands.
So we're like superheroes?
That's right. We're a family of superheroes who are going to help save the world.
So, what are our superpowers?
Well, we can see the demons while other people can't. Fenton?
I didn't know what to say or how to feel.
Do you understand what I told you? The judgment day's here.
I didn't realize it at that moment, at least not consciously, but my happy and mostly secure world had just been flipped over, and there were dark things under there.
Judgment day is here.
Very dark things.
We've been chosen by God.
And my little boy's mind just couldn't take it.
That the only thing we have to fear is itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There is nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre.
Hello, and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of The Fear of God, where we discuss that curious intersection between Christian faith and the horror genre in whatever medium that takes shape as on the given week. With you, as always, is myself, Nathan Rouse. Typically with me is co-host Reed Lackey, but he said something about seeing demons and needing to vanquish them, but it wasn't like murder because they weren't really people. They were actually demons. It was a little kooky. It wasn't really a track I could follow, but, you know, I trust Reed. We've got a long history together, not just of recording this podcast for all of you, but also just a good friendship. And I'm just trying to see how long I can go before Reed, there you are. You're back. Buddy, you did it. You are drenched in blood. What has been going on, my friend?
Well, I have some bad news for you, Nathan.
Uh-oh.
You're on my list.
Oh, we just almost had to censor this episode. Because I don't like being on anybody's list.
No.
I do worry I am on a few. But welcome to you, my friend. Guess what? We are, like Baskin Robbins, at number 31 this week.
Yeah. Episode 31.
You know, episode 31. We've been doing this thing for, what is that? Just over half a year, 8 months, 9 months, something like that.
Yeah, just about 8 or 9 months. Yeah. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. I want to say a special thank you again to Bill Oberst Jr. for delivering that wonderful reading of The Raven for us last week. If you haven't checked that episode out, please go check that episode out because it's I'm really proud of it, and I'm very, very appreciative of the work that he did there. So yeah, I've been out, vanquishing demons in my way,
as you do.
It were.
But see, that's just what you do. I mean, that's like just.
Yeah, I mean, I call that Tuesdays, right, where I just vanquish demons. That's the norm. It's the new normal.
When the Lord issues the call, who are you to reject it?
It's so.
But before we dive too deep into our content of the day, I want to just, sometimes we'll recommend things and talk about stuff we're diving into. So, hey, guess what, Reed? Guess what I just watched the other day?
What'd you just watch the other day?
In prep for our upcoming series that I'm extremely excited for, Springtime for Shyamalan, I did watch The Visit. And I'll save, the bulk of my response for our actual episode, but I loved it. I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it.
I did too. And you and I both had an interesting conversation. Again, we will save this for our upcoming Springtime for Shyamalan episodes, but, we'll get into this. I think Split is perhaps objectively a little better or more accessible movie, but I loved The Visit. I thought The Visit, in terms of pure enjoyment, I think I might have even enjoyed The Visit a little bit more than Split because it's so much fun. I enjoyed it so much.
Agreed.
So before to fully embody what we're toying with here is that starting next week, we're going to do a little mini series called Springtime for Shyamalan, where we're going to dive into the catalog of M. Night Shyamalan. And I know that probably a handful of listeners just got very excited, and another handful of listeners just rolled their eyes and groaned and wondered if they're still going to listen to us. We'll ask that you please listen to us.
I was going to say, and to those people, we'll see you in 6 weeks. Because what is our rundown? We're doing 5 episodes.
Yeah, we're going to do 5 episodes. We'll probably talk about, in some degree, all of his films, but we will do formal conversations about, we're going to cover Split, we're going to cover The Visit, we're going to cover Signs, we're going to cover The Village, and we're going to cover The Sixth Sense. So we'll devote lengthy conversations to those 5 films and probably brush up against, a handful, if not all of the rest of his catalog.
A few of those in particular, I am happy for an excuse to dive back into watching those.
Yeah, I love him as a filmmaker. He's very divisive for reasons that I can kind of understand in some ways, and some reasons that I can't understand. But yeah, we'll have plenty of time when springtime comes.
That's a lot of Springtime with Shyamalan. I'm excited. What a great title. Two other little things I've been engaged in lately, and I want to hear from you. I know one of them we'll share here, but one I did pick up. Zelda Breath of the Wild. I'm going to go full nerd here. And, it's unfortunately occupied far too much time for a grown man with 3 children and responsibilities and a job and all that. But it is pretty amazing. If you ever got into that world, I definitely recommend it. But that's a very short thing. I will say I did just watch last night, and I know you had a lot of good things to say, and I would share probably most of those. I did see the Beauty and the Beast. The new,
yes.
live action one.
Yeah,
it was a lot of fun.
I adored it.
It was intense.
Yeah, I adored it. I mean, some people said, like some of the more harsh reviews basically revolved around thinking that it was too beholden to the original and couldn't compete with the original. But for me, I mean, that just really sort of melted away after about, 45 seconds. Like the moment that I hear the opening music and the prologue starts, I was just swept away. And I thought it was absolutely delightful. I really enjoyed it immensely.
What's funny about that, so I read very little, editorial about it beforehand. Because I knew I was going to take my kids. And so kind of once you're going to see a thing, or for me at least, I just don't even bother. But I am not, as so many are, a huge devotee of the 91 version, I think is when it came out.
Interesting.
I like it. Well, no, hear me. That's not me saying it's a bad movie.
Sure.
To me, that era, for me personally, is more Lion King, Aladdin, probably Little Mermaid in there too. But Beauty and the Beast, I was never just a massive fan of. I recognize its place. And so I actually felt like this take did a more interesting job with some of the narrative elements and some of the character elements.
Yeah.
There was parts of it that just made more sense the way it was presented in this version. I mean, I really dug it.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think the character flourishes that they did add, I thought they worked very well. And I thought it really deepened the world and deepened the story that they were telling. And it is an almost 30 minutes longer than that original cartoon. So they had that they gave themselves that space to expand in that way, and I think they well utilized their time. I was a very big fan. My wife and son and I all saw it, and yeah, we were all very enamored with it. We thought it was really, really wonderful. So,
and are you gay now?
He is. My son is. So just I
was gonna ask it that way, but I figured I'd go the less insensitive route.
So just fair warning. It's you'll catch it.
Yeah. What I did find interesting about that, and we won't dive too heavy into that particular strain of the conversation, but one thing I found so brilliant about that movie is Josh Gad's performance. He's great. He's the original. All he did was take what's on screen in 91 and make a live action version of it in a way that's brilliant. Yeah. I mean, he's fantastic in that role.
Yeah. He's my favorite performance in the entire piece. And I loved most of the performances.
I mean,
well, for obvious reasons. Yeah, I don't know. I got to level with you, Nathan. I don't know how much of that's staying in.
Okay. So, yes, Beauty and the Beast, Springtime for Shyamalan. Good stuff. Looking forward to it. So let's switch gears. Let's dive in. We're talking today about the movie Frailty. Yes. Bill Paxton directed. This is 01, 02?
This is 2001. Yeah. I can't remember, and I should have looked up. I believe that it was actually released in 2001, but it may have happened late in 2001 and had a more 2002 release. I didn't look up to find out. But it was definitely made in 2001.
You know, talk a little bit about what informed, because I mean, you were a big advocate of let's talk about Frailty.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I had mentioned this last week. This is a bit coincidental. I had mentioned last week that when I was first conceptualizing this show, there were a handful, maybe 6 or 7 episodes that I knew like, ooh, I'm really excited when the time comes to do this episode. And one of those was The Raven. One of them was actually Let Me In, which worked out well as a companion piece to Dracula. There's a few others that we haven't gotten to yet, but one of the episodes that I knew like, ooh, we will do an episode on Frailty, and I will be very excited to have the opportunity to do an episode on Frailty because I love this film so much. It's one of my absolute favorite films, has been since I first saw it. And I really, obviously, it's right in our wheelhouse in terms of an intersection of faith and horror because it's a horror film about religious subjects. So, it was something that I knew would fit really well for the format of our show. And it was always something that I knew we will get to this eventually. And then, in the untimely passing of Bill Paxton earlier this year, I thought now is an appropriate time to go ahead and have a conversation about this film, which was his directorial debut and one of only 2 films he did direct, and offer a kind of...
What was the other one?
It's called, I think The Greatest Game Ever Played, which, sadly I have not seen, but that's the other film that he directed. It's called The Greatest Game Ever Played, and I believe it is a story about an amateur golfer, who suddenly finds his way in like a major big league sort of avenue. Although admittedly, I sadly haven't seen it, but, he only directed a couple of films. And it's really a shame. I was looking up some interviews in preparation for this episode, and I do think that Bill Paxton was a bit of an underappreciated talent. He wasn't the kind of actor that would receive the accolades because he wasn't a chameleon performer. He was just a very competent, capable performer, always delivered a very believable, well, I think everything that I saw him in, I considered to be very believable and, very, competent, capable, fulfilled the role that he needed to fulfill. But as I was looking through some interviews, and I hope that this was not totally true, but you get the impression when you're listening to some or reading some of the interviews that he made that he was a bit disappointed in the general path that his career took. I read that he wanted to be a filmmaker, that what he wanted to do originally was direct, but that sadly he was rejected by every film school he applied to, which even as of an interview in 2011 seemed to hit him rather hard. So he became an actor because he wanted to somehow influence the way that films were made in that avenue. And then he kept waiting for a role that would sort of break the door open for him in all these avenues. And it never really came. But it's funny. It's just something that as I was reading these interviews, it made me rather sad for 2 primary reasons, maybe a third. Let me start here that it's always sad to hear about any sort of creative artist who you think seems like a decent person and has a lot of talent that they seem to not necessarily be where they would love to be in their career or in their dreams. So that's always a little sad to consider. But, if it's not a horror film, I think it would be classified as a thriller, but it's not really something that we would necessarily talk about on this show. But if you have not seen the film directed, ironically, by Sam Raimi, who is a horror director, but if you've not seen the film by Sam Raimi called A Simple Plan that stars Bill Paxton.
Yeah, that's good.
That is an amazing movie. It's got some stunning performances. Thornton? Yeah, Billy Bob Thornton. Billy Bob Thornton delivers a phenomenal performance. Bridget Fonda's in it. She does a great job. And Bill Paxton it's my favorite performance by him. And I think it definitely well deserves to be seen. It's a brilliant film. And that I think is one of his best performances. And he thought, at least according to the interview that I read, he thought that film was kind of going to put him in a better position, sort of be on the map. And it didn't quite work out that way. But it was shortly after doing that film in 99 that he did pursue making Frailty. And Frailty seems, when I read like behind the scenes stuff, it seems to have almost been a kind of a community effort in some ways. Like he cast some of his personal friends. I mean, Powers Booth became a friend of his when he did Tombstone. Matthew McConaughey became a friend of his when he did U571. So he cast people who were close to him. And then He even, in small and sometimes non-speaking roles, cast like random friends he had made just in his local life. Like one of the victims in Frailty is a guy who parks cars at a Beverly Hills hotel that he had just befriended, and he asked him, invited him to come and have this cameo in this film. It's a non-speaking role, but so it just seems like a real sort of almost a community effort to make this little low budget thriller. And
well, you're also illustrating, sorry to cut you off there. You're also illustrating, with his passing, it is, I didn't know the backstory of his sort of ambitions or unmet ambitions as they were. But I do remember when he passed away, there was such a swell of, at least the people I follow and pay attention to, of just sadness and sort of goodwill towards him, because, you got the impression people genuinely liked this guy. Yeah. And he was, almost regardless of his talent level or what have you, just seemed like a genuinely nice person that people were appreciative to have worked with over the years. Yeah. And again, for better or worse, in terms of his, possible, didn't quite quote unquote get there. He was a pretty accomplished character actor, showing up in a lot of things just here and there. And so he did have a lot of people for whom, when he does pass away, as he did, there's a lot of response to that. And that was kind of cool to see. I know that doesn't, posthumously, that's not going to do much for him, but in terms of just, being able to see the impact someone had in the position in which they were placed is pretty cool.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And speaking to his, and I loved reading this, speaking to his character acting, I couldn't agree more. Like, I get the impression that anybody who worked with him just automatically became his friend. Like, I can't find anybody who has a bad word to say about him, either about his work ethic or about his general demeanor on set or anything like that. And he stayed friends with almost every director that he worked with, to the degree that Frailty, he showed early cuts of the film to like Sam Raimi, James Cameron. He showed early cuts of that film to them. He's like, hey, what do you think? What advice would you give? And some of them gave him advice that he then heeded. And before it was released to audiences, he made some quick changes to it and everything. But as far as his character acting is concerned, I loved reading this, that he is the only actor that was killed by all three of the major science fiction horror villains. He's been killed by an alien, a predator, and a Terminator. And I just thought that was really cool and kind of fun. Yeah, he's the only actor that had a death scene in each of those three major franchises. That's funny. And I'm just like, that's wonderful. Yeah, I just thought that was great. And I have a lot of fondness for him, and I have a significant amount of fondness for this movie. I love this movie a lot.
Well, that's a good segue. Let's execute. We skipped it last week for The Raven due to its a bit unorthodox sort of medium we were engaging, but hey, it's time to bring back our good friend, Mr. David S. Pumpkins. All right. So
let's do it.
We are going to assess Frailty on a style, which is a bit interpretive, intentionally so. Yeah. Style, scares, and substance.
Yes.
So if you're somehow just catching us for the first time, we scale these three areas on a 1 to 5. And we put them up on our Letterboxd page for the Fear of God podcast. So, starting with Frailty. So, I got to warn you, Riri, you're going to be a little disappointed with some of my responses here.
Ooh, already I don't like. Dislike.
I know. But maybe you can help me figure out, because I can't quite put a finger on where some of this lies.
Okay. Yeah.
So
we'll talk about it.
So we'll start with, okay. You might. We'll start with style. For me personally, in terms of style, which I encapsulate as just sort of the general, how do you feel about it? Do you like it? I gotta be honest, it's probably gonna fall at about the, out of 5, probably about a 2.5.
Okay.
3, maybe 3. But I'm gonna stay, I'm gonna go honest, and then maybe I'll change it by the end of it and go 2.5.
Okay. All right. So I gave style a 4. And for me, style means less enjoyment, because if I were doing it based on enjoyment, I would give this a 5 for style. Style for me is just, in general, like, how is it made? How is it approached? Doesn't necessarily reflect like budget. It doesn't necessarily reflect, performances or anything like that. It's just in general, what is the direction that this film took? Do I think it was a bullseye, or do I think there were some things that kind of were up and down along the way? So for me, this one lands at a 4 for style.
Cool. That's probably the lowest I'm going to go of these three. But for scares, I would probably put that at a solid 3.5.
Okay. You and I agree on this one, because that's my, for
There's some
scares,
decent,
that's
like,
me,
jump moments and stuff.
Yeah. But this is not necessarily a film that I would really classify as being traditionally scary. I think it's very creepy and very eerie, which we'll get into when we actually get into it. But I think in terms of, like, if somebody's looking for terrify me, I want to be scared, this is not that film. I think it's very good for a lot of reasons, but in terms of general scares, I'm about the same as you, 3.5.
And then our last category being substance. You know, I think I'm probably going to go, see, I do these in the moment. I like things fresh. You know?
I hear you. Don't like to prepare. I understand.
No, that would mean I just didn't watch the movie.
There you go.
You know, I've got notes. I'm probably on substance going to go probably again 3.5.
Okay. All right. 3.5. I am a solid 5 for substance.
I hear the disappointment just dripping out of your words here.
No. It's okay. Honestly, it's all right. But no.
It's okay. Looking up my friends list.
And so,
rather to host this one.
Amazingly, given your low numbers, Frailty still manages to pull a 10 out of 10 of David S. Pumpkins.
Right.
I'm really shocked. You know,
I don't know how it happened.
You know,
it's rigged, man.
No, so sincerely, I'm really not that disappointed in this rating, because sincerely, given now, some of it is because I gave it a 5 for substance, but so our official formal David S. Pumpkins aggregate is that we give Frailty 7 out of 10 David S. Pumpkins, which is in league with Bride of Frankenstein. It's right up there. There's Exorcist only Exorcist only got 8.5. So, and that was your fault.
I love that though. You're probably going to put on our letterbox an asterisk with this, like, this is weighted for the Nathan curve.
No. Like, I publish all of our notes. So I publish yours and mine. So everybody knows who to blame. So when everybody comes back, it's like 2.5 for style.
Right.
Let me go to the typewriter and let Nathan know.
I'm sure that one guy will follow suit.
You know who you are. Oh man. So a 7 out of 10. I'm happy with 7 out of 10 David S. Pumpkins. I mean, personally, I would probably give it more, but I'm happy with that. I think that's fair.
You tried.
Yeah, I sure did try.
You know, I got to keep you honest. Well, let's jump in. So we did our pumpkins.
Yeah.
David S. Pumpkins. Let's dive into some trivial bits. How do you feel about your trivial bits? Rudy?
I love it. Well, the biggest thing is that, and this is terrifying, this is partially based on a true story, which always freaks me out when I hear about this. It was inspired by the screenwriter whose name I want to look up so I don't say it wrong, is Brent Hanley. Is partially inspired by a story of a man in the mid-70s named Joseph Callinger, who killed several people and wounded several more, and he did so in the presence of his 13-year-old son, and claims that God told him to do it, which is really...
Yeah, that sounds, you know, it's sad when it's like, yep, I buy that. That really happened. That's really a sad response.
Oh, it's awful.
You know what's funny about you saying that is years ago when David Fincher's Zodiac came out, my wife and I were watching it at home, and it's funny now, like the thought of her watching a movie like that with me, it seems like another world, but...
Right.
About halfway through it, the way she tells the story is it's like, I put on a scary mask and told her this. It really wasn't that bad. But, about halfway through, I just happened to tell her, I was like, man, you know, this is based on a true story. Like, in my telling, it would probably be like this real offhanded remark, like, wow, can you believe? The way she tells it, it's like I put a flashlight under my chin, like, oh, true story. And it totally freaked her out to the point that even now she's like, why did you tell me that? So yes.
Yeah, I
true
believe
story.
I mean, that was honestly all I had in terms of trivial bits, because anything else sort of starts to get into the specific details about either theme or what I like or dislike about it. But,
I've just got 2 little bullet trivial bits here. One is Powers Booth can't not play a bad guy.
Yeah, I thought about that. He's got one of those looks.
Even when you think they're going to swerve you and be like, because I've seen this once before, years ago I didn't see it in the theater, but I did see it on video. So it's been years, but I did remember just the general arc of the story. And even rewatching it this time, I didn't specifically remember, okay, it took me a while before I was into the movie to remember, okay, that's right. He's really leading Powers Booth away because got something on him.
Right.
But it took me a little while to recall that. So that first half hour, I was like, wow, old Powers, man, he's playing straight. Sure enough.
Nope.
Nope. Not at all.
Not quite. Yeah, that's true. So here's a couple of things that I liked. Shout out to one of our listeners, Philip Hurd. I watched this film in black and white when I rewatched it to prepare for this. I've taken to doing that recently. Come on now.
So you're watching like a whole different movie.
Well, yeah.
I didn't even know you could do that.
Of course you can do that. You can change the color on your TV and watch it in black and white.
Come on, man. I just push power and play.
Well,
that's all I know how to do.
Well, you know what? I engage more with.
You should have told me that's how you're watching these movies.
Well, I don't watch it. I don't watch them all that way.
Bride of Frankenstein was like in such vivid technicolor.
Pulled darn near Wizard of Oz on Bride of Frankenstein when they were showing that. No. I mean, I don't do it for every film, but I specifically wanted to do it for this one because it being a little bit more of a sort of, well, it's an independent film, low budget film, a more microscopic story. I wanted to see how it play out. And I think this film works so well in black and white. It feels very much like an hour and a half Twilight Zone episode and has a kind of a neo-noir feel in black and white. I think it works really, really well. And not to say that the use of color was, something you could easily dismiss in any film. It's just interesting if you've seen a film. I always recommend when you're seeing a film for the first time, watch it the way the director released it. Watch it the way the director intended. And, which sometimes that's not the film you get, but as often as you can, watch it the way the director intended. And then if you want to revisit it, you can play around with things.
You just futz around with
do whatever you want to do at that point.
The balance and the contrast.
Exactly. Yeah. But
turn it down, turn it way down and just watch a silent movie. Do it. Pretend it's a silent movie.
Exactly.
And just watch what happens.
See if you enjoy it that way. But I loved this film in black and white, not only because of, like I said, the feel that it had, but that I'm constantly aware of sort of the gray area that this film delves in thematically.
I see how you did that.
Matches visually, Another thing that I like is I like that we don't see any of the quote unquote destructions. We only see the killings. The people who are quote unquote killings in the film, we see that. But if a demon is being destroyed, we don't see that happen. We don't see their death. We don't see their body afterwards. We see nothing. And I thought that was an interesting, he's creating visually a separation between those two events as they happen. And on that note, I love that Paxton made a deliberate decision to have you side with Fenton through the whole movie. Well, through the first viewing of the film. I had this experience when I was first watching it. Perhaps most of our listeners did too. Perhaps you did too. That it's like when you're seeing it for the first time, you spend most of that movie going, man, Paxton is crazy. Something is like this man has totally just lost his mind and is insane and is taking his kids along for the ride. And that's by design. One of the things that James Cameron had suggested to Paxton was the original cut of the film. It showed what the people did. It showed sort of the demon reveals. It showed them all every single time he touched them, the first time he touched them. And Cameron suggested you need to move all of that to after the big twist reveal. You need to shift all of that over because then
which is smart.
Oh, brilliant. Because then we get to see, we spend most of the film sided with Fenton. And then when that big twist happens, it's like, oh crap. That was, that was completely different than how I was sort of, feeling about it. And then, the last two things that I'll mention for likes, dislikes, I really don't have any dislikes of this film, but for the last two things I'll mention for likes, it's a trope that shows up occasionally in horror films and in thrillers, but we haven't encountered it on something we've covered on this show, and that's the trope called the unreliable narrator, where you have somebody telling you things that are later revealed in, a twist in the film to not be the truth. I don't want to say some of those films in case some of our listeners haven't seen some of those films, and then they'll go into it like, oh, I'm hearing an unreliable narrator, so I guess I can't believe anything that I'm seeing right now. But it's an interesting trope, and I always enjoy when it shows up because I don't think it's used very, very often, but I do enjoy it. The other thing that I will say, again, shout out to, in loving memory of Bill Paxton, I think his performance here is so well measured and so well calculated that he always seems to me, even though he seems like a crazy man, he always seems like a loving father. And I think that it would be so hard for any actor to pull off. that he's able to play, that he seems like he has lost his mind, yet never for a minute do I doubt that he loves his boys and that he is doing what he thinks is right for his family and for his boys. And that is very difficult as an actor to strike that balance and make everything feel that believable. So again, Paxton was an underappreciated talent in his time, I think. But now I'm done.
Well, see, now I feel like, you've been holding out on me. Like, I didn't know you're watching our movies in black and white. It's just
this is the first one I've done this with.
You know,
this is the first one.
Well, let's talk about this. So there's some scary stuff in here. Do you want to address any super scary things, like real specifically? Well, for our purposes, I'll say mine. I did find that there's a couple of scenes specifically. So the scene with the nurse in the shed is pretty freaky. So that specifically was one that jumped out. And then, of course, Adam, when Adam does the deed in the end. I mean, that's a pretty terrifying moment.
Yeah. That's on my
Is that right? His name is Adam?
Yeah. Matthew McConaughey is playing. Yeah. Probably should have given big spoiler warnings, but yeah, Adam McConaughey introduces
Adam McConaughey?
Yeah. Adam McConaughey.
Madam McConaughey. Hey, guess what? I'm not drinking anything but water tonight, brother.
Look at that.
I'm good.
Meanwhile, I've got my devil's juice and Mountain Dew over here. Matthew McConaughey is playing Adam Meeks, but introduces himself in the very beginning of the film as Fenton Meeks. So it can be a little confusing. But yeah, when the big reveal happens and all of that takes place at the end, yeah, that's creepy as can be. I think that's very frightening. People actually test audiences actually walked out of the movie in the moment when the nurse is tied up in the beginning because they did not know what was about to happen and they thought they were about to see something horrifically misogynist and everything, which it's not. It's very restrained. Right. But Paxton had said that some of the test audiences, the moment they see this woman bound and gagged and tied up, that they just left the theater, and that was, disappointing to him and a little strange to him, and particularly because, it is horrific to think about, but again, we don't see any of the quote unquote destructions. It's all very restrained, for what it could have been. The whole movie is rather restrained, in my opinion, from what it could have tried to exploit. Totally.
Well, see here. Well, let me bring this up because, and don't just brush it off as Nathan the neophyte here. Not that you would necessarily. I'm gonna, you were vulnerable a week ago, 2 weeks ago about style and fashion. I'm gonna be vulnerable about just assessing something that I've struggled with about this movie.
Sure.
So I think for me, because so much of the latter half of the movie is strong. I mean, Paxton sells every moment when he's in the shed and seeing these visions that we can't see. The twist works. Mm-hmm. Especially if you're just really not thinking about there being a twist, it works well. One of the narrative elements, actually, it's really one of the filmmaking elements really that I have a hard time with is Paxton's character has such a turn in those first 10 minutes, right? Mm-hmm. You see this picture of this healthy whole, the mom's missing from the picture, but, the three of them, it's this healthy family unit. And I almost feel like, for me, there's a little bit of disservice, and I get it. I totally get it, to the audience not participating in any measure of his vision. The vision that propels him into this course of action, not the visions he has in the sheds. Because when he comes in, like you've just seen happy whole family unit, and then almost on a dime, the character of the dad re-enters the literal scene. And it's like, oh, guess what? I just had this vision from God. I'm going to start killing people. Oh, I'm not killing people. I'm vanquishing demons. You know what I mean? It was really, for me, and maybe there's a listener or two out there who's like, yeah, I struggle with that a little bit too. So sympathetic here, maybe. But if not, I'm just the dummy here. But it felt like a hard turn in a way that's like, we're driving on this path and, okay, I don't know. And again, from a thematic and from a knowing where the movie ultimately goes standpoint, it's reasonably served, but it's such a hard shift that it was kind of difficult to buy in on. I don't know. And again, I'm speaking from just sort of feeling and like, okay, I'm just kind of processing the experience because I do think there's value in the presentation as it is, meaning there's so little you know until you know it all.
Right.
There's value there, but suddenly I'm very judgmental of this character.
Sure.
In this moment. You know what I mean? You go from like, oh, this is real pastoral and quaint to, what the heck are you, what?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In a way that's a little too, it's very jarring and very hard to sort of connect to the next 20 minutes because you're just trying to get your bearings, I think.
Sure. Oh, well, I'm going to attempt to wholeheartedly validate you. I think the experience that you had.
I appreciate that.
No, but what I mean by the attempt is I am going to kick back a little bit against what you're saying, but I'm going to try to do so in a validating way, not in a contradictory way. I do think from the interviews I've read and from years ago, I listened to the commentary on this film, Paxton's commentary. I think you're supposed to feel that way. I think that it's part of the fear of this film. Okay, I'll approach it this way. If listeners haven't seen Lost, I'm about to spoil something for Lost.
Sweet.
I was, and you're probably going to laugh at this, but I'm being genuine. When I saw the finale of season 3 of Lost, when it aired for the first time, I was on a vacation with my family to the Grand Canyon. And we had just gone back to our hotel room. My mom and dad were just doing their own thing. They knew I wanted to watch this show, and I wanted to watch it that night because of how into it I was. So I tuned in and I watched that episode. They had actually drifted off to sleep before the episode ended. So the episode ends, and maybe I won't have to spoil it. Well, yeah, the twist that happens at the end of season 3. I was physically shaken by that twist. And here's why. And I'm relating it back to Frailty. The reason I
remember our conversations around that. That's how important Lost is to the DNA of our friendship.
That's right. So,
but go ahead.
I was physically shaken by it because I had sided with Jack so many times. For so long, I had sided with Jack and thought, Locke is insane. Locke is crazy. And he needs to be stopped. Locke absolutely needs to be stopped. When the show validates Locke's position, it shook me because I had related just as an audience member so strongly with Jack that I was genuinely like disturbed. Like, oh my gosh, I was so thinking that Locke had lost his mind. In Frailty, I think that part of what Paxton is reaching for is for you to think Dad Meeks is insane. So that when the film ultimately validates him, that's where the horror lies. That's where the real disturbing element lies, is that, oh my goodness. And I have a couple of things related to theme talking about that whole sort of validation. But I do think that it is supposed to be upsetting and supposed to be disturbing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to like it or mean you have to approve of it. But I do think that part of what you experienced is part of what Paxton as a director and a storyteller was trying to make you experience, that you're really there with Fenton. I wrote down a quote when Matthew McConaughey is telling the story, which how much can we trust what he's saying? But he's talking from Fenton's perspective, and he says this quote that I wrote down when I rewatched it. It says, and it's right after Paxton has said, an angel visited me. We're going to have to start destroying demons. He says, I didn't realize it at that moment, at least not consciously, but my happy and mostly secure world had just flipped over and there were dark things under there, very dark things, right. And my little boy's mind couldn't take it. So I do think you're supposed to really relate to Fenton in that moment. You're supposed to really be on board for him because at that moment you think Matthew McConaughey is Fenton. You think that that's your surrogate, that's who you're seeing all of this through. Right. So I don't balk for a second at your, really feeling very conflicted and very disturbed about Bill Paxton's character. Again, whether or not that means you have to approve of it, which I don't think it does mean you have to approve it. I do think that that's what Paxton's trying to do as a storyteller in your mind, is create those feelings of this guy is off the rails.
Well, and do you, that quote you just made, which I recall, do you think, in your assessment, that McConaughey, is adult Adam sharing child Adam's insights?
Perhaps, but I think I read the film that adult Adam is an agent of God. Now, we're going to get into whether or not, we think that's...
this is how he views himself, right?
Yeah, so he is an agent of God, which means anything that God wants him to be privy to, he's privy to, including possibly information about how Fenton felt in that moment. Even though, I mean, I don't know. It's just a possible reading of the film that he could be accurately representing what Fenton was going through, or he may just be, because he's an unreliable narrator, he may just be fabricating what he perceives Fenton to have been going through from his Adam-based perspective. So I don't know. And I think there's possibly a couple of different ways to take it once you get to that final reveal in the end of the film. But let me use that as a segue because I think that I was going to ask you this question. We did briefly pre-brief this, but do you have any thoughts particularly, and if you don't or need a minute, then I have some. Do you have any thoughts particularly on what the title means? Because nobody in the film ever says the word frailty. So do you have any particular thoughts on what the title is referring to or what it means? I have a few, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to it if you had any thoughts.
Well, I mean, I do think a great title is great because there are multiple levels to it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think such is the case here. And I know I had a bit of a mixed David S. Pumpkins read, but, as tends to happen on these, my appreciation can grow. I think one of the things that hurt my most recent viewing of it's been just long enough since the first time I watched it to not remember all the nuance. And so, you know what I mean? Like,
sure.
Like if I were to sit down and watch it tonight, it's like, okay, I'm going to pick up on a lot more because that gap wasn't quite so wide. But, I think there are a couple of major points about the title that seem suggested to me. But all of them have to do with relationship, the two components, one being the sort of frailty of our familial relationship, just the thin thread. And honestly, it called back witches for me a lot. Mm. And what I actually wrote down was, the problem with children is they trust you, and that's very much exhibited here. This frail, fragile, needs to be protected in a very particular way relationship we as parents have to our children.
Right.
And intentional or not, Paxton's character grossly abuses that relationship.
Yeah.
So that would be one interpretation. Another one might be just the again, both of these are going to serve this sort of thin line idea, but this frailty of our relationship to God, like in the dynamic of interpretation, and I'm sure we'll walk down that very long trail here in a minute or so, but, the frailty with which we understand and act on what we believe.
Right.
I think both of those are very much present in this particular story.
Right. I had, I resonate with everything you said. You're going to hear this, in a second, resonated back to you by some of the things that I thought. I made a list, a very small list of, okay, what are things as I'm watching the film, kind of trying to scratch at what does this title mean? So I made a small list. It's only 4 things that I noted that as I'm watching this film that appear to me to be frail or thin, like easily broken and easily misunderstood. So the first one is something you alluded to. I wrote down father and son relationships. You are kind of from a psychological perspective, most people tend to get their identity from their father.
Sure.
And again, that's just sort of a generalized psychological understanding. And, if the father is absent or if the father is particularly off kilter, then that's going to affect how you see yourself and who you think you are. So naturally, when your father's, one of your father's dying expressions, or, shortly before your father died, he calls you a demon. Well, that's going to follow you. that's going to stay with you. So I wrote down father to son relationships. Another thing, speaking to you, talking about our relationship with God, I wrote down that calling is very frail in this film. Like your calling as a person, what you are intended or supposed to do in this world and in this life is a very frail thing and easily misunderstood and easily abused. The other thing that I wrote down that's a bit more broad is morality. What is right and wrong? Well, we're not killing people. We're destroying demons. And,
right.
And that line is very blurred, in this film in a number of ways. And the other thing, the last thing that I wrote down as frail. So I had father to son relationships, calling, morality, and then, perception. that how somebody perceives something, what they think is really going on, is very frail. And I think that as human beings, we do suffer, although we do not go through what the Meeks and what these characters go through, but we suffer frailties in each of those areas from time to time, I think. If we're attentive to them at all, then we suffer from them. How many times have you heard from believers or non-believers the phrase, well, you missed your calling? And often it's given as sort of a lighthearted joke, but that's something that a lot of us wrestle with. Why am I here? What am I supposed to do?
Right.
What's my purpose? What's my intention? And I think this film, depending on sort of where you're at in life and where you're at with those kind of questions, can push some buttons that that might make you think about how you view the world and how you view God. You know, like at one point, Fenton Meeks, again, this is Adam Meeks presenting Fenton Meeks' thoughts, but he says, you know, I was disgusted by my father's God, calls him my father's God, you know? And so there's this tenuous understanding of exactly what God wants and what God is and is not okay with in this idea. And it's really fascinating to me that this is a very Southern Gothic tale, even though it's, you know, Gothic might seem an odd word to use, but it reminded me a lot of like the work of Flannery O'Connor, who has a running theme in her works of like violence as grace, like something violent happens and it's actually an act of grace in your life. And I thought about that when I was watching this film again, of like, wow, yeah, that this they think in their perspective that they are doing good in the world by committing acts of violence and destroying demons. And the film, in a very bizarre kind of way, I'll be honest with you that we're going to talk about it, but I don't know how I totally feel about this. We're exploring, not explaining. I'll just put it beforehand. The film appears to validate that perspective. It appears to validate in plot points, not just in understanding or interpretation. In narrative plot points, it validates Adam Meeks and by extension his father. In the fact that the quote unquote demons that they destroy did terrible things, did horrible things.
Right.
So that's validation number one. Validation number two, all the freaky stuff that happened with the video with McConaughey and the fact that nobody can remember his face and the fact that he's standing there talking to somebody who shook hands with him and does not remember that he spoke with this guy.
That's such a great moment when he steps out as, I mean, it's scary as hell.
Yeah.
Steps out as the sheriff.
Oh, it's so wonderful.
So before you travel too far down that path, I did want to, it's interesting this mention of calling. And, you know, if you want to examine this from a biographical standpoint, you know, you talk about Bill Paxton's ambition and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe my guess is you probably experience this to a certain degree. I know I do, like this way in which as you progress through life and get older and life builds up around you, you know, whether it's children or responsibilities or job or whatever, where vocation in a fruitful way can sometimes feel very elusive. And to the point that you could, listeners may hear me say this and be like, is Nathan okay? I'm totally okay. But there's a way in which you can start to feel like, oh, I'm going to make a desperation call here. You know what I mean? And just sort of cast my whole being and self and all that's attached to me this one direction.
Right.
And you watch what happens in this movie and that's what happens, right?
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
You've got this very kind of blue collar guy who we don't get a ton of insight into his psyche pre everything, but you know, I mean, he's us. He's probably in this case, late 30s, early 40s, got his 2 boys he's trying to raise. He's working at the garage.
Right.
Like there's not a whole lot of what we would attach quote unquote calling on his life. And so, you know, that sort of casts again this whole vision he does or doesn't have that we aren't privy to.
Right.
In a dubious, you know, we're tempted to be dubious of it because it feels like such a desperation move. Like, this is kind of what you do when your lot in life and your psychology start to conflict too much.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Again, frailty, you know, speaking the frailty of our own position in our respective world.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. And I think that
fine. You can bump up the pumpkins a little bit.
No. I'm happy with 7 out of 10. It's fine. And diving into that word a little bit, I don't know that this is necessarily exactly a definition, but, I think when I hear frail, the first thing that comes to my mind is easily broken. If it's frail, I equate frail with fragile.
I thought you were going to say that Jars of Clay song.
Oh, see, no. I do like that Jars of Clay song, but I think I'm equating frail with fragile, which might not necessarily, they might not necessarily be synonyms, but, frail, just, like weak, and it doesn't hold together. It's not solid. It's not substantive. And I think about the ideas that we hold so tightly to, like what you talked about, this, even just an understanding of what our family life is going to be like and how it's going to play out. I really sympathize. Granted, this is the horror genre, so it's very extreme in Frailty, but it's a very common experience for for sons to reach a certain age and realize, oh, my dad is not who I thought he was. He does not navigate through life in the way in which I thought he did. Now, in this film, there's a definite flip. There's an event. There's a before this and an after this. For most of us, it happens in a much more foggy and gradual sense, where you say like, man, I just did not perceive my dad to be this thing. And I think that it could happen. I'm talking about father to son relationships because that's the dynamic in the film. I'm both a son and a father of a boy. And it's one of those things that's on my mind continually about just the way that I interact with him and the way that, am I sometimes being too hard? Am I sometimes being too harsh? Am I sometimes, instilling things that are appropriate for me but may not be appropriate for him into his life? And I'm not saying that wouldn't happen with daughters, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen with mothers of sons, but it's something that is eminently on my mind frequently as my son gets older and as I think about how he's going to navigate through the world. And as a person of faith, it's difficult for me sometimes because there are a wide variety of I'll call it this way. Hopefully listeners will hear what I'm saying here and not what I'm not saying. That there are varieties of faith out there that I do not want him to adhere to. There are versions of faith that I don't want him to adopt. There are specific versions of faith that I want him to run from, and ones that I want him to adopt. And ultimately, I don't have very much control over that. And here's where I sympathize, regardless of what his intentions and thoughts about life are. Here's where I sympathize with Bill Paxton. His character is that he's got one son who is just on board and gets it. And he's got another son who is absolutely going in the opposite direction. I mean, when you're watching the scene, and again, I was a bit more remembering of the specific beats of the movie, but the scene where he sits his son down at the table and he reveals to him, like, the angel told me something about you, but I don't want to believe it, and we're going to prove him wrong. And the angel told him that his son was one of the demons that he was eventually going to have to destroy. And I don't know, it's one of those things where, the disillusionment can happen in either direction, where a father can find out that their son is not who they hoped they would be or dreamed they would be, and that they're not who they hoped they were. And a son will likely find that out about his father as well, that they're just not the man that you thought them to be. And it's a very fragile thing. It's a very frail thing, and requires. So just
life sucks, and you become a demon hunter.
Yeah, guys, this is a very downbeat episode of the Fear of God.
Your allusion a minute ago to the validation the movie makes of their behavior makes me think like the sequel to this. It's a series. It's just, we just watched the origin of Adam Meek's Demon Hunter. Like it's Frailty was the movie launch pad for the TV series.
Yes.
Featuring Matthew McConaughey.
Yes.
And they just couldn't get the money for it.
No.
I mean, I think all of that is super valid, and even the Jars of Clay song. And I'm not being facetious there. I really like them. But a theme I want to throw at you is, and it's more a phrase that we can just unpack some. And what I wrote down is the problem of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and yes, you know, you can make the case, okay, well, the movie validates, like, it's certain, it's definite, these things are happening. So, you know, we're sort of setting that little notion aside a little bit. But even as you identified already, there's a very unreliable narrator to this tale. There are a lot of events in the movie that speak to our real comings and goings with people of God and people of faith.
Yes.
And they may not be, though some might be, but I'm not speaking in the main of people, who are saying that person's a demon, I should kill them. But there are people who are saying, Reed, this is what God says about you, to you, from me. And you might think, well, that sounds a little questionable. No, it's real. This is what it is. And there's this really interesting moment in the movie where child Adam comes to, where Paxton is sitting at the table with Fenton. Yeah. Dinner table. And young Adam wanders up. And what does he say? He says, "Oh, I've got a list." Yeah. Yeah. And Paxton says, "Well, where'd you get this?" And Adam says, "Well, God gave it to me." Mm-hmm. And it's a really fascinating moment, because if you just take that little scene in a vacuum, well, our natural inclination is to trust an adult, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to lean towards him, but we know that the subject of a list, or God giving someone information in what we're meant to believe is a valid way, has already occurred. Right. So now this is conflicting information, or supplemental information to what we know up to this point as the only recipient of God's imbuing knowledge. You know what I mean? Like, it's this, but that particular moment is dripping with practical application for us, right? And I'm going to pat myself on the back for like this most genius insight, but I'll give, I'm joking there, everybody, but because I really feel like it's this challenge to me, and perhaps by extension to you, Reed, and other people who are hearing this, but I keep coming back to this God as head, us as body image. And because what that means is we don't have to know anymore. We don't have to be certain anymore, because this is what happens when you are certain. Not you kill people, but everything you're certain about is going to come into conflict with someone else's certainty about God, right? Right. Right. And I just think there's such a danger, you know, clearly in this movie, the subject matter plays that out, but, you know, there's such a troubling phenomenon in the church. And, you know, your particular brand of church upbringing is probably riddled with it. I mean, my gosh. Oh, yes, I just read, I don't know if you saw this. I just saw a news piece about 2 weeks ago. It was this extensive story about this fringe church in Rutherford County, which is near Gardner-Webb, where we went to college. Yeah. About this church that for decades has physically abused, spiritually abused, and silenced all these people that came and went through their congregation, because the power there, the folks in power there, were threatening, you know, well, if you do this, God's going to take away your child. Basically, these sorts of things. You know, if you report what has happened here, God's going to take away your child, or you're going to lose your child. You know, all these threats, right? Which, you know, we look at on paper and think, oh, look at the crazies. But there's a way in which we still do things like that sometimes, not to that level and not to that severity. But there's such a danger we can exercise. And hear me, it sounds like I'm saying you can't know anything about God. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is trouble that can come when you start getting too certain. Yes. About your version of things, I think. And I think I would say that to a degree, depending on the context in which we're talking, there are contexts in which I would agree with the statement, you can't know anything about God. There are contexts in which I would agree with that statement. To be clear, that's not precisely what I was saying, but I think you're just extrapolating. Yeah, I'm just extrapolating that one part. Okay. But in the broader sense of what I believe you're saying, yes, I grew up in a charismatic culture. I'm still part of a charismatic church. And
there is a perpetual danger that someone is going to come up to you and say, and I have had it, I have experienced it in my life to the degree that my wife and I will have discussions about, things that have happened to one or each or both of us and, or to our friends, where we'll say like the moment, and I'll say this purely for my own perspective, people that I love and trust implicitly, the moment they come to me and say, God told me something about you, or God told me this, or God told me that, does not matter the depth of relationship that I have with them or the depth of relationship I know them to have with the Lord, I will immediately be skeptical. I will immediately meet that moment with a severe amount of skepticism. And I've reached this place to where anytime I hear that, I believe two things, and some listeners are going to think I'm insane. That's okay with me. I believe two things. First of all, I do believe that God speaks. There are some listeners who, in their theology, they do not account for that, and I understand that. Maybe I'm wrong. But I believe that God still speaks to his people. And the second thing that I think is, I think he does so deliberately and without the flippant frequency that we often hear people claim that he does. And so I always keep those things in tension, because I've had experiences, and I'm not going to go into the details because they're really not important to the point that I'm making. But I've had experiences where the same exact person, the identical person on the same exact night, told me one thing that, quote unquote, God had told them that was absolutely false and absolutely untrue. The same night, from the same person, they told me something that I have no idea how they possibly could have known, because I had not told anyone, even my own family or friends, what I was wrestling with, and things eventually played out that proved what they said to be correct. And I don't know how to, I don't always have the right understanding of how to place those things in my heart. Because the fact that you hear one thing, supposedly from the same source, that God told me this, and it's immediately dismissible. But then there's another thing that's like, where in the world did that come from? Where in the world did that happen? And that life and faith eventually proved it all out. So the point that I would, that's what we're talking about. That's what we're wrestling with, is this idea that these things are frail. These things are fragile. Right. And I think that if I would offer a piece of advice on that, I would say, not to categorically dismiss when somebody who you know to be a sincere and discerning person speaks such a thing. Don't categorically dismiss it, but at the same time, don't wholeheartedly swallow it. Take it and put it in a pocket where you can reason it out, chew on it, talk about it with fellow believers, with people who you understand to just know life and know practicality, and take these kind of things, just in the scripture. This is not the scripture I'm going to bring in a second, but the scripture says, in the presence of many counselors is much wisdom, which seems kind of like a no-brainer, but surround yourself. So it's just lots of therapy. Basically. Lots of therapy. I'm down with that. Surround yourself by people you know because you've examined their life and you know them to be wise. Surround yourself by people who you know to have a modicum of wisdom, and then extrapolate these things with them and discuss them with them and reason them with them. Come now, let us reason together. You have a thought? Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've got the title is creeping back up on me, and I think I would add to the mix. It's sort of just a different version of something we've already alluded to. At least it's just people are frail. Yes. And this is making me think of was it Carrie? We were talking about the double-edged sword of faith, faith being a double-edged sword, and how, you've got to be sensitive and delicate with how you wield it, because it can cut everyone around you. Well, same idea here is like, people are frail, man. And I say that not dismissively, as being one for whom the power abusers and the powers and principalities and the manipulation that comes from people and structures above you can dent and ding and harm and wound. Yes.
in such a way that sets you on this really dark path. And so, dark path in the movie at least, but for us in the real, that dark path can simply be coloring now, our own inherent frailty being dented and dinged and abused will now color how we interact with the world around us.
Yes.
Our abuse at the hands of people of faith in power will now color how we interpret and view people of faith and power.
Yes. Right.
And you take that to just a parental standpoint, and it's a whole different kind of microcosm, but it's the same idea. There's the frailty of people around us and our own selves.
Right.
For better or worse, the Bill Paxton character is open to this level of suggestion, and he heeds it. He is himself frail.
Yes.
These children he is responsible for, of course, just by virtue of development, frail.
Yes.
And are prone to be victims of abuse of power. And that's definitely what plays out. Anyway, I don't know, just the title kept creeping back up on me.
Yeah. Well, and we should probably wind down, but there's so much that we could spend about this topic alone. And I can say with confidence that depending on the movie or depending on the story, we're going to revisit this idea again, I'm sure, because it's a very important subject and a very vibrant one for discussion. I struggled a little bit with the scripture that I wanted to bring in, the deliberate scripture, because it can be read a couple of different ways, but I'm going to read it and then tell you why I chose to bring it in with this conversation. So Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus was sending his disciples out for their first missionary mission, and he's sending them out and he instructed them, I'm sending you out essentially as lambs among wolves, and he gave them a certain list of things that they should and should not do while they're out on this journey. And he talked about the people were going to reject them and people were going to possibly even do violence to them and that sort of thing. This is the passage that I wanted to read. Matthew chapter 10, verses 26 through 28. It says this: "So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell." There's a number of reasons why I struggled.
You're going dark here, man.
I know. There's a number of reasons why I struggled with that. But, Jesus said it. Our King said it. When he says this, I'll bring in Stephen King here, because Stephen King has commented several times about his belief of God or not, depending on where he's at in his life. But actually, I don't know if he said this or if he was quoting somebody else. But I know he's where I remember first encountering this quote. He said, people need to remember two things. First of all, there is a God. Second of all, you're not him. And so taking that idea, again, I'm not saying, Stephen King's this devout believer or whatever. He's fluctuated over the years. But at one point...
Well, you did go from the words of Jesus to now I'm going to bring in Stephen King.
Well,
you really did a little bit of...
You have been my friend for a long time. Yes. That's what I do.
I love it. I love it.
But this idea, when he says, do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul, I struggle. We talked a little bit off mic. I struggle with needing people's approval. And somebody comes to me, hey, God gave me this word for you. Yes, I'm skeptical, but in that moment, it's also very possible that I'm going to be as desiring of their approval as I would be of God's.
Sure.
And so the reason that I'm bringing this in here right now is whether or not Daddy Meeks is crazy, whether or not this film is purporting an Old Testament philosophy or not, whether the lines of lunacy and sanity are clearly defined or are blurred in this film, here's what I do believe, and here's what I do know. I do believe there is a God. I do believe I am not him. And so, as a result, I think there needs to be some degree of understanding on my part that I can't be afraid of other people as if they are the substance on which I rise and fall. I cannot be afraid of, our show is called The Fear of God, but we don't talk a lot about the fear of man, about the fear that this other person, I've got to do what this guy tells me, or or my career is over. I've got to do what this person tells me, or this is my last shot in life. I've got to go with this person. I've got to stay in this relationship. I've got to participate in this activity, or else all of these things unravel. And I do think that in that context, I would again quote the words of Jesus: "Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul." Now, when he says, "Be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell," I will point out that he does not say who will destroy both body and soul in hell. That's a separate conversation, and we don't have the time or really the inclination to get into it right now. But I will say there is divine wisdom in recognizing, do not fear man more than you fear God. Do not fear what they will do to you more than you recognize, hey, I believe this is what God would have me do. And I do think that that's wisdom, whether you're in the privacy of your own home, in the public area of your jobs, or your place of business, or your endeavors, the political spectrum, the social spectrum, wherever you are. Do not fear them. Do sincerely be cognizant of your relationship with the Lord, and making sure, if you are a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ, that you are attentive and actively seeking in the presence of fellow believers and in community how you should live and walk that out. It also says elsewhere in the scriptures to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And does this mean we quiver in our boots at that God is not approachable? No, I don't entirely believe that. I believe that because of Jesus, he is very approachable. But I think we must always keep that in mind, that we as human beings are fickle and frail. And we need constantly to lean on something that is far more substantial and that is beyond us, and enter into the mystery, as it is called. So yeah, I'm going to get a lot of letters, or possibly a lot of comments on that whole diatribe.
Or to quote one of our mutual favorite shows, just let the mystery be. Let
the mystery be. Oh, the leftovers. So we have tossed, by my count, about 29 grenades in about 17 different backpacks with this whole conversation.
So have fun with that.
So there it is.
Go in peace. Go with God.
But the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it is not the end of the conversation. And let me be a little blunt about that. That this is in fact a conversation. It's an exploration. There are plenty of things that I will admit that maybe I'm wrong about. I don't express any belief that I believe to be wrong, but there are plenty of things, because my perspective is limited and because my understanding is severely limited, that I may get wrong. We're exploring this intersection and exploring this understanding, and I don't think there's a better word to put on an exploration of the divine and the finite than frailty. That's what it is. It's very, very frail, very, very fragile. So we would love to know what some of your thoughts are about all of this, and you can reach out to us in a variety of ways.
Do you mean like we'd like to know some of you who are listening's thoughts, as in excluding others? Or are you saying all of you who listen, we'd like to know some of your thoughts?
All of you who listen, we'd like to know some of your thoughts. You don't have to share everything, but we'd love to know some of what you think, particularly about this film and about the show in general, about the conversation we've been having. We've gone a little long here, but I think that especially toward the end of the conversation, it warranted it. But we do, rest in peace, Bill Paxton, and we wanted to cover this film because I do think it's a great film. And as we've already exemplified, worthy of tremendous discussion.
I would retroactively throw it a few more halvesies.
Yeah, see, I knew we would. We would. But yeah, we would love to know your thoughts on this film, about the career of Bill Paxton, about this conversation that we've been having. And you can do so in a variety of ways. You can reach out to us on Twitter. Nathan, what's our Twitter handle?
@TheFearOfGod.
You can also like us on Facebook and post something there, or comment to one of our posts there. You can also follow me on Twitter @ReedLackey. And Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter besides The Fear of God?
@TheNathanRouse.
You can also go to morethanonelesson.com and comment on one of the specific postings there. You can email us, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. Also, go to iTunes and leave us a review there. We would tremendously appreciate that, because it is a way to sort of put our show into the ears of more audience members.
And go see Beauty and the Beast. Give Disney your money.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, what are we doing next week, Reed?
So next week we're going to dive into something. Speaking of, not ruffling any feathers or any controversy. Next week we're going to be starting Springtime for Shyamalan.
Yes.
We are going to be diving into a 5-week series on the films of M. Night Shyamalan. We are going to start with his most recent 2017 hit, Split. And I am very, very excited to dive into this, and I'm excited to do so with you. And hopefully, listeners, you will also be along for the ride. We would love to have you there. Nathan, as always, thank you for being my friend. Thank you for everything, really, and for having this conversation with me. I appreciate it.
Likewise. I appreciate it all the same.
And thank you, listeners, as well. We will catch you next time. We'll see you next week.